Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Robert Henning. I'm the director here at the Rockpile Museum, and I'm pleased to see you out tonight for our presentation. Before I introduce our speaker, thank you. Just a few announcements. We've got some flyers in the back, and if we run out, Justin can print some more with upcoming events for this summer. Please take one of these. Then you can know about all the fun stuff we have planned. And there are a few things that we need to add to this because we're always planning, adding programs and events and speakers. So another good way to stay up to date is to join the Rockpile Museum Association. If you're not a member, please join. You can get the newsletter. We'll email you about events and programs, text messages if that's your preferred method of communication. And you can sign up or join our Facebook and as well as our YouTube channel. We are broadcasting tonight, so welcome to everybody on YouTube and Facebook land. If you see the subscribe button somewhere down here, please hit it. Then we'll notify you about all the upcoming programs on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I want to introduce David Marcum. David is an independent researcher studying the history of the transcontinental airway in Wyoming and the history of the Cold War in our state. He is a graduate of the University of Wyoming and is retired from the United States Air Force. He's also retired from LCCC, where he taught political science courses for over 20 years. He currently lives in Cheyenne with his wife. Please help me welcome Dave Marcum.
This is nice. Welcome. A couple of things. You guys, to get extra credit, are going to have to write a one-page paper. And on that paper, you're going to have to tell your professor, your instructor, 7 things that you learned from this lecture tonight. So you have to put your phones away sometime. You're doing it. Good. Okay. So as Robert indicated, my name's Dave Marcum. My wife tells me this is the best picture ever been taken of me, because you can't see my face, of course. Yes. I got to tell you, so this is when I was in the Air Force and we were engaged in an exercise. It was while I was stationed in England. Remember back when COVID kicked in and everybody was moaning and groaning about face masks? Try working 12, 14 hours a day with a gas mask on and then complain about having to wear a face mask. I tell you, it is not fun. Got to get some housekeeping chores taken care of here. We are going to see some lectures. There's going to be some language used tonight that some people might find troubling, offensive, just to kind of give you a heads up, okay? I apologize beforehand if I offend anybody. That's not my intent, but it's just, you know, sometimes you can't get away from that when you discuss things like war and the way we wage war and things like that. You can't see me, can you, Robert?
No.
I have wandered off. I have wandered away from the camera. I'm sorry. I tend to do that. Okay, first thing we need to get taken care of, and this came up, so this is like the 4th, 5th time I've done this lecture. Most of my lectures have been done down in Laramie County. If you're not familiar with the Cheyenne area, Cheyenne is home of F.E. Warren Air Force Base. F.E. Warren Air Force Base supports 150 nuclear-armed ICBMs. Cheyenne is ground zero if World War III ever starts. And the first time I did this lecture, a person took me to task for my use of missile in the title. If you're paying attention to the title, it was Bombing Wyoming, the First Intercontinental Missile Attacks against the United States. So we need to get that taken care of right now. A missile is any object that is forcibly propelled at a target. So yes, a balloon could be a missile. The rock that David flew at Goliath, I'm sorry, I'm missing my Bible here. Who did David slay? Help me out here. Goliath. It was right, wasn't it? Yes, the rock that David threw at Goliath was a missile. The bolts and the arrows that medieval archers flung at each other were missiles. And of course, the ICBMs that we live with down in Cheyenne are, of course, missiles. First bit of context. And I talked to a couple of you before the start of class. And the high school kids are talking about Vietnam right now. Is that correct? Yeah. So I'm going to give you a little context leading up to the actual balloon attacks. You can't understand the Vietnam War unless you understand the context of Cold War politics and things like that. You can't understand Fugo unless you understand some of the things that happened before World War II, that kind of happened before the attacks on the United States actually occurred. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the development of aerial warfare. This tendency that we have now of dropping bombs on people's heads. The first recorded instance of aerial bombardment in history occurred in 1849. When the Austrian Navy actually used balloons to bomb Venice. Venice had declared war on it. Venice is actually part of the Austrian Empire at the time, and it actually declared its independence from Venice, or from Austria, and the Austrian fleet couldn't get close enough to bombard Venice, and so they launched balloons against the city. Didn't do much damage, but established this precedent of actually bombing people from the air. Jump ahead about 66 years. If you studied World War I, you will have heard about the Zeppelin raids against Great Britain, the use of these massive dirigibles, these massive Zeppelins to drop bombs on London and other places on the British Isles. What is sometimes lost in our discussion of World War I is the fact that following the Zeppelin raids, both Germany, Great Britain, Italy developed very, very, very large airplanes to bomb one another. So here's a picture of a German bomber, a British bomber. These are all from World War I. These are pretty massive examples of aircraft technology for that period in history. The Italians actually were very, very, very willing to use airplanes to attack Austria during World War I. I love this. So as part of my research, I go through newspapers, old newspapers, and I was going through newspapers in Cheyenne at the archives, and I came across this article from the Cheyenne newspaper in 1918. Huns not bombing Cheyenne as many persons believe. So this is 1918, Cheyenne, Wyoming, sitting out in the middle of nowhere, and people are running around town just absolutely convinced that the Germans are attacking the city. What apparently had happened was that a building was blown up, just normal construction. It was an old building. They needed to bring it down so they could build a new building. And the folks in Cheyenne convinced themselves that it was the Germans attacking the city. Kind of give you an idea of how people really, 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 really got very anxious about this notion of airplanes dropping bombs on their heads. That still just cracks me up. There was not an airplane on the planet that could reach Cheyenne, Wyoming from Europe. And yet people were absolutely convinced it was happening. Unfortunately, aerial warfare did advance. The Japanese were very adept at bombing Chinese cities during World War II, inflicting mass casualties on the civilian population. Germany, during the Spanish Civil War, notoriously bombed a Spanish city called Guernica, which is celebrated in a famous Picasso painting. The Blitz, of course, when Germany bombed London during the Battle of Britain, or in that period around the Battle of Britain, which Britain then, of course, retaliated for in Operation Gomorrah, in which the RAF, the Royal Air Force, absolutely leveled a variety of different German cities. So you've got the aerial warfare developing in Europe and other parts of the world, pretty limited, but it's also assuming a very intercontinental aspect. Again, if you're familiar with aviation history in this country, before World War II started, the United States had built several large bomber airplanes that were capable of flying intercontinental ranges. It's the XB-15, sister to the B-17, the more famous B-17. Douglas built an even bigger airplane, the XB-19, which had to be built out of doors because the factories in Santa Monica weren't big enough to allow them to actually build this airplane inside. Germany built several airplanes, at least they developed several prototypes. Hitler really wanted to bomb the United States. And so two German aircraft companies developed bombers that were capable of flying. It would have been a one-way trip from the French coast to New York City. But Hitler really wanted to bomb New York City. Didn't happen, but the capability was there. You may not know this, but, and we're going to mention this again very briefly, but there was a really nasty campaign, a really nasty battle that was fought between the United States and Japan for control of the Aleutian Islands. Once we had chased the Japanese out of the Aleutian Islands, we started launching aerial attacks from the Aleutian Islands against the Japanese homeland. A lot of Americans don't know that. And it would be an example, at least an early example, of intercontinental warfare occurring during World War II. More famously, of course, the United States Air Force flew a long-range mission from Libya to the major German oil refineries in Romania, Ploiești, 2,200-mile round trip. It was a bloodbath. I mean, our attacking forces were absolutely decimated. But again, you're starting to see the development of this notion that we can attack our enemies intercontinentally, which is, of course, what the Japanese did when they floated their balloons towards the United States. And then finally, for most of our history, the United States has been very, very fortunate to kind of sit what they were called our ocean walls. You know, on the one side we had the Atlantic that would protect us from Europe. On the other side we had the Pacific that would attack us from Asia. That notion that we were, you know, invulnerable, that we were kind of immune from attacks by our enemies, started breaking down actually in World War I with submarine warfare, but very definitely in World War II. Again, the Germans waged very, very vicious submarine warfare against the United States that actually came right up to the shores of the United States. These two pictures are tankers that were sunk by U-boats that were actually taken at Cape Hatteras in North Carolina. There are people on the beaches taking pictures of these ships actually sinking because the U-boats had sunk them. And this was a fairly common occurrence in 1942, 1943, until we started developing technologies that allowed us to defeat the U-boat scourge. A lot of people do not know this, but the only instance of Germans landing in North America occurred when a German commando unit landed in Canada, in Labrador, and established this automated weather station. If you're familiar with the bombing campaign that occurred in Europe during World War II, the 8th Air Force, the RAF, weather became very, 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 very important. It became very, very important to the Germans to be able to determine when weather conditions were going to allow the 8th Air Force and the RAF to attack Germany. And so you had this kind of the battle of meteorologists, if you will, occurred during World War II. And like I say, the single instance that we know of German infantry actually landing in North America occurred when they set up this automated weather station. Wasn't discovered until the 1970s. There was a geologist who was wandering around in Labrador and stumbled across this equipment. And of course, had German language and instructions all over it. The German government was contacted and said, oh yeah, we remember that from World War II. And so this unit is actually in a museum in Ottawa. Kind of interesting. On the other side of the country, the Japanese attacked the coast of the United States on several different occasions. Of course, we had the Pearl Harbor attack isn't on the western coast, but kind of started things going. On February 23rd, 1942, a Japanese submarine shelled Santa Barbara, California. And then about 4 months later, give or take, in June of 1942, a Japanese submarine attacked a fort at the mouth of the Columbia River. Did you know that the Japanese actually attacked Pearl Harbor twice? On the night of March 4th, 1942, the Japanese sent two of these very, very large flying boats, flew a very, very, very long distance across the middle of the Pacific and attacked Pearl Harbor for a second time. Because only 2 airplanes were used, it didn't cause a lot of damage. But what they actually were up to is they were doing reconnaissance in the lead up to the Battle of Midway. And so that's kind of a forgotten episode in the history of the United States. But again, you know, the fact that American territory is being attacked by our foreign enemies, and we're no longer able to kind of hide behind our ocean barriers, if you will. In June of 1942, as I indicated earlier, the Japanese attacked the Aleutian Islands. They bombed a military fort at Dutch Harbor, inflicted a number of casualties against the American forces that were located there. That then caused, like I say, this nasty battle to occur between the United States and Japan. We weren't going to let the Japanese sit in the Aleutians. We weren't going to allow them to claim that they had conquered American territory. So we chased them out, and as I indicated earlier, we then started launching air raids against Japan from the Aleutians. On September 9th, 1942, a Japanese submarine launched an airplane. The Japanese actually had submarines that would carry these little seaplanes that were capable of carrying a single bomb. And in this one instance, the Japanese submarine launched an airplane and attacked, basically dropped bombs on the national forest in Oregon. The hope was to start a forest fire, and we're going to get to that in a minute because that's very, very important what the Japanese were trying to accomplish with the balloon attacks. That's a picture of the airplane that was used to attack the forest in Oregon. The Japanese actually, that's the pilot. He actually came back to the United States after the war was over and apologized for dropping a bomb against the United States. That's so Japanese. I mean, to come and apologize for something that maybe they thought they had done wrong. Japanese were actually developing a larger seaplane that they were going to use to attack the Panama Canal. Didn't use it for that purpose, but eventually these airplanes were used in kamikaze attacks against our naval forces during World War II. Okay, so you got to understand all of that to kind of understand kind of what's going on here with Operation Fugo. Research begun on what became these balloon bombs began in 1933. I found one source that says 1927, but I'm going to go with 1933, by a special Japanese Army research group that had been formed to study, to develop unconventional means of waging warfare. Didn't have much of a budget, and so it was terminated in 1935. Fugo, nobody's really sure what Fugo means. It can mean a couple of things. Go in the Japanese language has a variety of different meanings. For our purposes, we're going to take it to mean number. Okay, so go means number. Fu is actually the 32nd character in the Japanese alphabet. So Fugo could mean it was the 32nd weapon developed by that special research group that I mentioned earlier. The problem is they didn't develop 32 weapons. And so the most common acceptance, the most common use of Fugo, as far as this context is concerned, is that Fu is short for Fusen Bakuden, which in Japanese either means fire balloon or balloon bomb. And Fugo, therefore, means it is a fire balloon project. So Fugo, fire balloon project to attack the United States. So why? They abandoned this balloon research in 1935. Why return to what seems to be a very archaic form of warfare? The Doolittle attack. Okay, in 1942, if you're familiar with the history of World War II, the U.S. aircraft carrier Hornet launched 16 land-based B-25 bombers, which in and of itself was just an amazing operation, and attacked the Japanese homeland. Didn't inflict much material damage, but really shook the Japanese up. Okay, really showed the Japanese that we were capable of attacking their homeland. Remember, this is shortly before we started attacking them from the Aleutians. And so the Japanese decided, okay, we've got to somehow gain some kind of face by attacking the United States homeland more completely than we have been with some of our submarine attacks. And so it's because of Doolittle that they returned to the balloon project and started developing it. Okay, so the plan is this. We all know about the jet stream. We've all heard about the jet stream. Jet stream is this really, call it a river of wind that kind of circulates around the planet. And that river of wind can really gather speed, and it can really cook across the planet. The Japanese were very aware of the jet stream. We were very aware of the jet stream. If you go down and read some of the accounts of airmail pilots flying across Wyoming, they would sometimes encounter the jet stream. There's this famous incident where Jack Knight, who is one of the famous pilots in the airmail, takes off from Cheyenne. He takes off at night. They knew exactly he was going to Rock Springs, and he knew 2.5 hours. If I putter across the state, 2.5 hours, I will get to Rock Springs. So he putters across the state, 2.5 hours, looks down, there's the lights of a city, he lands, he's still in Cheyenne. He's been flying for 2.5 hours into the jet stream and made absolutely no progress. And so we knew about the jet stream, we just didn't know it was the jet stream. We knew about these vicious winds, but nobody had really systematically studied them. A Japanese scientist, however, had studied them. And he is generally credited with being the scientist to first systematically study the dynamics of the jet stream and how the jet stream behaved and what caused the jet stream and things like that. And what's interesting is he published his results beginning in 1926, but nobody read his results because he published them in Esperanto. If anybody is familiar with Esperanto, Esperanto is a make-believe language that was developed in the hope that scientists would be able to communicate to one another. Didn't quite work, but for some reason he published all of his research in Esperanto, and of course nobody read it, and nobody was aware of his findings, except he was Japanese, and so folks in the Japanese government were aware of what he was doing. And so again, what they were going to do is they were going to float balloons from Japan to the United States, taking advantage of the jet stream to gain revenge for the Doolittle attacks on the Japanese homelands, demoralize the American public, and that's pretty rote for aerial bombardment. One of the reasons you bomb cities is you want to demoralize the public. You want to demoralize the civilian population. You want to threaten critical natural resources. We'll talk about that here in a second. Generally disrupt the American economy, force the United States to reallocate resources to fight forest fires and to defend the homeland. So, their goals were pretty good goals. Okay, they were trying to disrupt our ability to wage war against them. Okay, a little bit of a digression here. We all know about forest fires. Okay, everybody knows about forest fires. We're going through this bout here recently about the last 10, 15 years of just massive forest fires. The problem is the forest fires that we're seeing today are not the worst forest fires we have experienced in the history of this country. The worst forest fires we have experienced in the history of this country occurred in 1871, and they actually were a system of forest fires that included the Great Chicago Fire, which started the night of October 8th. Remember, Mrs. O'Leary's cow was supposedly kicked over the lantern and started the fire and things like that. Well, the Great Chicago Fire was all part and parcel of this larger system of events that destroyed 1.2 million acres in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, killed between 1,500 and 2,500 people living in the UP. You had the Great Michigan Fire. So you had the Peshtigo Fire here, you had the Dewar Fire here, and you had the Chicago Fire here, which, as my slide indicates, destroyed thousands of acres of timber, killed thousands of people, and destroyed lots of structures. And so we're aware of forest fires. People around the country, around the world, are aware that the United States is prone to forest fires. And so that's what the Japanese were trying to exploit, was this vulnerability that we have in this country to forest fire. There was a precedent to Operation Fugo, to what the Japanese were doing. The British had actually used balloons against Germany during World War II. They had a shorter distance to cover, so their balloons weren't quite as sophisticated as we're going to see the Japanese balloons were. They were much cheaper to build. As a result, the British launched many more balloons than the Japanese did. We guesstimate that about 10,000 balloons were launched by the Japanese. The British launched almost 100,000 balloons against Germany. There were two types. One actually had an incendiary bomb attached to it, and of course they were trying to start a fire with that incendiary bomb. The other thing they did is the balloon would trail a wire, a very, very stout piece of wire, and the hope was that that wire would get entangled with electrical transmission cables and then short out the grid, which was very, very effective. I mean, this was a very effective program. It did disrupt the German economy and kind of served as a precedent for what the Japanese were doing. The first British balloon was launched in the spring of 42, and they continued to launch them into the fall of 44. So obviously a project that the British were very, very, very committed to. Okay, so how was Fugo constructed? The balloon envelope was made from a Japanese paper that is actually produced by boiling mulberry bushes. They basically make a mulch out of from a mulberry bush, and they work it and they work it and they work it and they work it until you get a nice thin sheet of paper developed from that mulch. They would take that paper in Japanese, in Japan, in Japanese is actually called washi. In Korea, it's called something differently. In China, it's called something differently. So this is a very, very typical way of producing paper in the Far East. You would take 5 layers of that paper and laminate it. They would actually glue them using a vegetable paste that was made from potatoes. If you know anything about potatoes, you know potatoes are very, very starchy and can actually be used to develop a very, 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 very effective glue. And then once you had the laminated mulberry paper put together, you would then lacquer it with a vegetable oil-based lacquer, which produced a very, very durable, very, very tough paper. That's just cool. Developing paper from a mulberry bush. The folks who actually were responsible for that work were you and you and you and young, well, they were young high school girls. Young high school girls were not fighting. They were not in the infantry. And so they put their excess labor, young high school girls, to work making these balloons, making the balloon envelopes, making the paper. They worked in absolutely horrible conditions. I don't know if any of you guys have been to Japan or Taiwan or China, but we're talking the tropics. We're talking sweltering heat. And they worked in buildings that had no ventilation, had no air conditioning. It was just absolutely horrible conditions, and put together these balloons. So they are laminating the paper, sewing the different panes together. And of course, as you might imagine, we're talking pretty big envelopes here, so they had to use pretty big buildings. The caption to this particular picture indicates that this is a gymnasium somewhere where they're actually making the lanyards, making the rope that attached all the parts together for the balloon. This was the operational side of things. So you had the balloon up there. This was the bombing mechanism, if you will. What you had, well, let me see, I think I got a slide that shows this. Yeah, so you had a battery case which powered everything. You had a barometer box. Each Fugo balloon had at least 4 barometers. Okay, crucial because, as we're going to talk about, the Japanese, the intent was to have these balloons basically maintain an altitude of between 30 to 40,000 feet. They didn't want the balloons going any higher than that. They didn't want the balloons going any lower than that. So you have to have a barometer to measure your atmospheric pressure so that you can determine, what your balloon is doing. You actually had 4 barometers on the balloon. You then had a mechanism that would alert the balloon to whether it was getting too high or whether it was getting too low. If it was getting too high, it would vent air. If it was getting too low, it would drop some of the ballast sacks that it had attached. The design was such that once it had dropped all of its ballast, the balloon then knew that it had to drop a bomb. And for a kind of an archaic bit of technology, it was actually pretty sophisticated. Okay, the balloons were filled with hydrogen. The hydrogen was manufactured locally. This is a part of the operation that kind of confuses me because you can manufacture hydrogen through a process called electrolysis. by which you take water and you separate the hydrogen molecules from the oxygen molecules. You can create hydrogen. They apparently didn't do it that way. They apparently did it chemically, and I don't have a handle on how they did that. I've never heard of anybody producing hydrogen chemically, but apparently that's what they did. And so here is, whoops. These are American service members surveying one of the launch sites after after the war had finalized. Again, there's where they manufactured the hydrogen, put into the envelopes, and then the balloons were launched. Of course, a balloon like that, if you've got a stiff wind blowing, is going to be pretty tough to handle. Okay, so they launched their balloons. The jet stream, in theory, would carry the balloons then to the United States. Once it had dropped all of its ballast, the balloon was alerted to drop its bombs. And like I say, a pretty simple plan, but like I say, pretty sophisticated. So again, the balloon lifts off at night. Okay, it's going to stop. The air is going to get a little lighter. And so the balloon is going to want to drift downward. That's when you start dropping your ballast. I got a new pointer here, and I'm still figuring out how to use it. Okay, during the day, the air would expand, and it would vent the air, but you want to keep it right in here between 30 and 40,000 feet. Okay, drop ballast here, vent air, drop ballast, vent air. And then once you have dropped all your ballast, hypothetically, you're going to be over the United States. You're going to be over the National Forest of the United States. And you're going to drop your bombs, and hopefully you're going to start a forest fire. Our first encounter with these balloons occurred off the coast of San Diego and Hawaii. Patrol planes started noticing these balloons floating on the surface of the ocean. Had no idea what they were. We had no idea what was headed our way. We didn't know if they were barrage balloons. If you're not familiar with these pictures, you see pictures like this coming out of World War II. All these, but this is D-Day. All these balloons, hovering over the D-Day landing zones. These balloons are over London. They're barrage balloons. They're hypothetically, in theory, they're supposed to make it difficult for airplanes to attack your forces. So you got all these balloons in the way. You've got to weave in and like that. So we didn't know if these balloons that we found in the Pacific were barrage balloons. We didn't know if they were weather balloons. Starting to sound a little bit familiar. This is also, if you watch Fox News during the Chinese balloon thing, they were all over this. Oh my God, the balloons are carrying. Oh, come on, Dave. The balloons could carry soldiers. They could carry saboteurs. They could carry spies, poison gas, biological agents. Oh my God, yeah. But again, we didn't know. We had no idea what these things were, what they were up to. Okay, we're going to come back to that here in a minute because a couple of balloons in Wyoming are important to the story. Okay, so got two maps here. So we think, so the problem with studying a project, an event like Fugo, is that most of the Japanese documentation associated with this program went up in flames when we firebombed Japan. So it's been difficult for us to really pin down exactly how many balloons they launched. We think maybe 10,000. We have no idea how many of them made it to North America. If only, if 10% made it to North America, then 1,000 balloons made it to North America. And that's kind of the working assumption that about 1,000 of these balloons, out of 10,000, actually made it to North America. We think we have records of between 300 to 400 of those balloons actually being sighted somewhere in the United States and in Canada, because Canada was also getting a lot of these things. And that's what this map shows. This map shows verified sightings of these balloons. And I want to get to that here in a minute because there's a problem there. I like this map better because it's just better to visualize. The deep red is where most of the balloons came down. And then as you get closer and closer to yellow, that's where fewer and fewer sightings are. You'll notice that Wyoming orange we saw a fair number of balloons here in Wyoming. Also notice that one made it as far east as Michigan. Okay, so these balloons, like I say, were pretty capable balloons. They were pretty robust. They could travel a ways. This is from Robert McKesh wrote probably, as far as I'm concerned, the best analysis, the best study of the Fugo balloons. These are the balloons that he says made it to Wyoming. He had one come down at Thermopolis. This was an important one. We'll talk about it. Manderson, Newcastle, Kirby, Powell, Linda. We're going to talk a little more about Newcastle. Gillette Basin. And then the Technical Air Intelligence Center says that an additional three balloons were sighted at Worland and two at Casper. And then I found newspaper reports that say a balloon was sighted at Cody and one at Douglas. So 13, 16, okay, give or take. Okay, two of these balloons are really important. Okay, so we have no idea what's going on here. There's balloons coming down, and we don't know what is going on here. The night of December 6, 1944, there's an explosion at Thermopolis. They first thought it was an airplane coming down. They thought it was an airplane crash. But they do a little bit of investigating, and they put two and two together, and they say, no, this was the first recorded instance of a bomb actually coming down in North America. And so now we know what's going on. The Japanese are launching these balloons, and they're dropping bombs on us. Okay. They're either trying to kill people or they're trying to start wildfires in the American West. Okay, it's after the Thermopolis event that the United States government imposes censorship on these events. They don't want the Japanese knowing how many of the balloons are actually making it to North America. The theory is that would be providing Japanese with intelligence as to how their operation is working. We don't want the Japanese to know about how their operation is working, and so they impose censorship. That's why it's really, really, really hard to come up with an actual number of balloons, because nobody was reporting them because of this censorship. So Thermopolis was really important. Glendo is important because the balloon that came down at Glendo actually still had the ballast sacks attached to it. And what happened was that a group of geologists took the sand that was in the ballast sacks, and they studied that sand to try and determine where the bombs were actually being launched for. And it's called forensic geology. Where you actually use geological method to solve a crime or solve a case like this. Where are they coming from? You can actually take sand and you can look at the grains of sand and you can tell where in the world that sand came from just by virtue of its chemical and geological makeup. And so the Glendo bomb becomes very important because they identify the launching sites as being north of Tokyo based on the sand that was recovered from the ballast sacks. Okay, so this is the balloon that was recovered at Newcastle. They actually did. They recovered the envelope at Newcastle. In fact, Penny, are you here? Where's Penny? Did she leave? Because her family, this balloon actually landed on her uncle's ranch. Yeah. And so typically what would happen, a balloon would come down, locals like us would kind of look at the balloon and say, what the hell? What the hell? They contact law enforcement. Law enforcement would come out and said, okay, it looks like a balloon. We need to call the FBI. They call the FBI. The FBI would come out. It'd take them a while, and then they haul everything off. And so here's your balloon, Penny. Yeah, okay. What's cool about this balloon is that somebody sneaky snipped a bit of the balloon before the FBI showed up and hauled it off to Washington, D.C. So you guys ever see Indiana Jones and the what is it, the Lost Ark? Who's seen Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark? Nobody? Oh, come on. Okay, well, my analogy here is not going to play very well because you guys haven't seen the movie. Well, at the end of the movie, you got the Ark of the Covenant, and remember what they do with it? They put it in the warehouse somewhere. That's where I think all these balloons. There's some warehouse out in D.C. sitting there, and that's the last we've seen of them. But before the FBI showed up to haul off this balloon at Newcastle, somebody went out and clipped a bit of the balloon, and the Newcastle Museum actually has a bit of a Fugo. The only pieces I know of that still exist in this country down at the Newcastle Museum, which I think is kind of cool. You'll see this picture identified as being the balloon that came down in Thermopolis. The problem is no balloon came down in Thermopolis. The balloon dropped its bombs and then disappeared. There was no balloon recovered in Thermopolis. And so this is misidentified. This is not a balloon from Thermopolis, Wyoming. It actually is a balloon that was recovered at Burns, Oregon. Okay, and so like I say, that with the censorship and the destruction of documents in Japan, we aren't really sure how many balloons were launched, how many balloons made it to the United States, and it's all a big mystery. Results, not much. Okay, we're gonna get to there are two major problems with the Japanese balloon attack. However, one of the results of the balloon attack against the United States, remember we talked about the British, how they had two types of balloons. You had one that had bombs, you had one that trailed the wire, and they would get wrapped up in transmission lines. Well, one Japanese bomb actually came down at Hanford in Washington. If you know anything about Hanford in Washington, it's where the plutonium for the A-bombs was developed. And a balloon came down at Hanford, wrapped itself around a transmission line, and actually shut down power for a day or two at Hanford. And there's a bit of there's some irony there, I guess, in that. It wasn't a huge inconvenience, but still, caused some problems. Tragically, probably the worst outcome that happened here was that because of the censorship, a balloon came down in Oregon. A church group was out in the forest having a picnic. They came across the bomb. They played with the bomb went up, and 6 people were killed. Okay, 1 adult and 5 children were killed in Oregon. The only Americans to die in the contiguous 48 United States because of an enemy attack. And they've got a nice memorial at the site of the bombing. Again, though, there were 2 major problems with Fugo. First of all, the jet stream, at least the jet stream that cooks across the western part of the United States, is most active in the winter. Okay, and what happens in the winter? It snows. Okay, this is when we get most of our snow. You aren't going to start many forest fires in the middle of winter in the United States. Okay, they started a couple, but not so much. The other problem was they're unguided. The Japanese balloons they couldn't target anything. They just let them go, and hopefully they were going to come down and cause problems for the United States. So, like I say, didn't produce a lot in the way of results for the Japanese, but did trigger a bit of a response on our part. There is a bit of irony involved in the timing of Fugo. So the first Fugo balloon that was launched against the United States was launched in the first part of December 1944. Prior to 1940, at the start of World War II, the United States actually had something that was called the Ground Observer Corps. It was a group of people that would go out and look for enemy attacks. Remember our article from Cheyenne in 1918? Well, we're still convinced at the start of World War II that, that the Japanese or the Germans are going to launch attacks against the United States. And so you had this early warning system that consisted of people that were standing out looking for stuff. Well, by 1944, that had been disbanded because it was clear nobody was going to attack it. So the instrument that we could have used to look for Fugo balloons had disappeared. Okay. But having said that, we did start committing some air defense aircraft to track down these balloons, which were very hard to shoot down, by the way. Apparently, it's kind of hard to shoot down a balloon. There were also military troops that were committed to going out and fighting any forest fires that actually were started by the Fugo balloons. Most famously, you had the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the Triple Nickels, which was an all-black infantry battalion, was committed to fighting forest fires in the western front. They were very, very disappointed. They wanted to go to Europe. Okay, they wanted to fight, the Germans in Europe, but they were kept back here and actually did go out and fight some forest fires. The big thing that stopped Fugo, of course, were the B-29 attacks against Japan that were occurring about the same time. We just destroyed their ability to produce the balloons. We destroyed their ability to produce hydrogen. And like I say, pretty neat story, but eventually didn't accomplish much for the Japanese. Okay, so legacy, and this is where we need to get serious. Okay. Like I say, we think that 10,000 balloons were launched against North America. We think that maybe 1,000 of them made it to North America. We've only recovered about 300 of them, which means what? There probably are bombs laying around the countryside out there for people to find. And indeed, people are still finding these Fugo balloons out in force. October 9th, 2014, some hunters up in British Columbia came across, and of course, the ring, the aluminum ring that carried all the stuff that we talked about earlier, is a clear indicator that this is a Fugo balloon. And of course, the tail fin to a bomb, should alert you to the fact that this is not something you want to mess around with. And so in 2014, they found a bomb in British Columbia. Shortly after that, in 2009, about 5 years later, again, the aluminum ring. So if you guys are out, hunting out in the woods or something like that, and you come across it, don't mess with it. Seriously, do not mess with it. The things will still explode. They'll still hurt you. Contact law enforcement, get a EOD out there so they can take care of this stuff. Because you got to believe there's still plenty of these things hanging around out there for people to find and play around with and get themselves in trouble. Okay, so Fugo, up until 1982, Fugo was the longest military operation in history, over 5,500 miles, okay? Fugo was succeeded in 1982 during the Falkland Wars when the British flew bombing raids against the Falklands. That was succeeded in 1926 by, they're called the Black Buck operation. I'm not sure why we felt the need to do this, but we flew B-52s from Guam all the way to Iraq, launched some cruise missiles, and then I know why we were doing it. We were actually showing the world, look what we can do. But that is now, to this day, still the longest bombing mission ever in history, 1,400 miles round trip. Okay, so this is a modification to the slide since I gave it last time because of what happened recently. So after World War II, the United States developed an anti-crop biological munition that was designed to be carried by an E-77 balloon, which was basically a copycat of the Fugo balloon. So we were going to take the Fugo design, attach nasty little bugs to them that would wipe out crops. And you can imagine who we're thinking about wiping out. We're going to drive them at the Soviet Union. Didn't go much further, but the United States has used balloons in a variety of different contexts for a variety of different reasons. You got all these different projects. Project Genetrix, we actually launched over 500 balloons from Scotland, Norway, and Germany to float over the Soviet Union to take photographs. And fairly successful operation. The balloons were flying across the Soviet Union. We would track them. When they left the Soviet Union, we would send a C-119 transport out to go recover the balloons and recover the film and everything. And like I say, there was some pretty good, I guess, some decent intelligence gathered by doing that. We're still developing balloons for a variety of different reasons. These are balloons that have been recently developed by the Army. The Palestinians have launched balloons against Israel, against our fires, set their crops on fires as recently as 2021. And then, of course, we have our little friend, okay? Yeah, this is a pretty sophisticated balloon, It really is. So if you go back, this is us kind of showing off. If you notice, this is a U-2, and you've got his silhouette on the balloon, and he's taking a picture of his airplane silhouetted against the balloon. That's us kind of showing off right there. But the pictures that were taken of the balloon are kind of cool because, first of all, notice that they're powered by solar panels. But the thing that really makes these balloons interesting is that you got an engine here, you got an engine here, you got an engine. They were propelled. They could actually direct them to where they wanted them to go. So a very, on the one hand, kind of primitive, but a very, very, very sophisticated balloon. Again, people were developing them. The Russians are developing them. The Europeans are developing the Chinese balloons for use asymmetrical warfare, for intelligence collection, battlefield command control, for jamming. We're developing balloons to carry drones, to drop bombs, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we still got use for balloons. Okay, so Fugo's one project I'm working on. I'm also doing research on the Ground Observer Corps. If any of you, so the Ground Observer Corps, were, again, during the Cold War, were people who went out and stood around and looked for Soviet bombers, okay? There were over 5,000 people who joined the Ground Observer Corps in Wyoming. And like I say, they would stand on, I'm gonna get used to my clicker, I promise you. They would stand on rooftops, they'd stand outside. This is over in Dayton, north of Sheridan. It was their old the fire tower. They used it as a ground observer control observation station. So if you guys know of anybody locally who was involved in the Ground Observer Corps, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know. SAC set up all kinds of radar bomb scoring sites in the state. This is a train that they sat over at Newcastle for a while. This is over at Powell. This is over at Little America. I've heard rumors of a similar operation here in Gillette. If any of you are aware of that, I'd love it if you would contact me. By the way, this is why SAC, or not SAC, this is why the Air Force still flies low level here. And you guys probably see B-52s and B-1s occasionally cooking across. That's why they do it. There's a target that's actually out by Hewlett. Kind of cool, make-believe SAM site. If any of you have any information about the radar site at Sundance, I'd love to hear from you. Kind of interesting, the first time a portable nuclear reactor was used to power a building. The reactor is still, the radars aren't there. By the way, there's Devil's Tower. If you go up on Warren Peak, you can actually look down on Devil's Tower. The reactor is still there, cooking away. If you know anything about gravity stations, I'd love to hear from you. And if you know anything about the Loran station, the Coast Guard station southwest of town, I'd like to talk to you. Get some of this recorded. Okay. There you go. The end. Okay. Questions? No questions? Okay. I did a good job then, I guess.
I can't believe that. There's got to be some questions.
Nothing?
There was one question I was thinking about when they were dropping the ballast.
Yeah.
Did they drop the whole bag or?
No. So they were programmed. They were designed 3 bags at a time. So what? Let me remember. There were 15 ballast bags, and they were designed to drop 3 at a time.
Okay, they went just let the sand run out.
No, they would drop the bag. Yeah, they would sever the bag from the ring and end of story. Yeah, because the bags were filled very, 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 very precisely. They knew exactly how much weight each bag was carrying, and so when it decreased too far, cut loose 3 bags. In theory, if things worked right. And again, we talked about the fact that the Japanese probably launched 10,000, maybe 1,000. So obviously, a lot of them didn't work. There were a lot of failures. They came. In fact, one of them ended up back in Japan. They launched it, and I don't know. It must have dithered around, and it ends up back in Japan. So yeah. So there obviously were some issues with this. Yeah.
How much were each bag weigh?
Oh God, I want to say 20 kilograms. Yeah. Don't quote me on that though. I'm really, really bad with numbers.
I would have thought the balloons would have gone up at night and down at the spot.
They went up at night.
Because it sounded like you said that.
No, they raise at night, and that's why you then release air to get it to come down. And then during the day, they would see.
Somehow I misunderstood what you said. I thought you said
Yeah,
that way.
well, it could be. I've been known to mangle my facts.
Well, you know, I've been known to hear wrong too.
Anything else? Go ahead.
What is a gravity station?
Oh, thank you. Good question. I like that because I asked the same thing. Okay, so obviously I went to high school a couple of years before you guys. Okay, and I was taught that gravity is gravity. Gravity is gravity, right? I mean, isn't that the whole point of what is it, the feather and the rock and everything? You know, gravity is gravity. Well, apparently that's not true. Okay, and so the gravity becomes important if you're launching an ICBM, and that ICBM has to land at a very specific point, 5,000 miles away. Okay, so if you guys aren't familiar with the story, F.E. Warren Air Force Base was the very first ICBM base in the country. And in fact, I would suggest it was the very first ICBM base in the world. Okay. F.E. Warren Air Force Base, the very first ICBM that the United States deployed was the Atlas. If you're familiar with the story, the first Atlas was guided to target by radio. It was radio guided. Okay. Radio guidance systems require a lot of infrastructure. And so gradually ICBMs transitioned from radio guidance to inertial guidance. Inertial guidance, to make it very simple, is basically computer guidance. Well, for a good inertial guidance system, you have to plug all kinds of information into that computer. That computer has to be very aware of the territory that the missile is flying over. And apparently there actually are variations in gravity depending on the geology of an area. If you're talking really dense igneous rock, that apparently can affect the pull of gravity. And so you had this Air Force unit down at F.E. Warren, and I would have loved to have been in this unit, that basically just traveled around the world measuring gravity. They would take readings so that they could then plug in those readings into their INS. And so when they went to a place and measured the gravity, they would set up, they're called gravity stations. They basically look like the old BLM benchmarks. In fact, I say old, they still, they look like BLM benchmarks, which is why you have to look really careful, because, a BLM benchmark has information on it. These flat out come out there. This is a gravity station, The gravity was measured such and such a date. And so I had no idea, what was going on the first time I encountered one of these things. And the Atlas is one of my projects. And so, yeah, if you guys know of any gravity stations, the picture I showed you actually is in the floor of the county museum down in Green River, which used to be the old Carnegie Library. So you've got the Carnegie Library has been converted into the county museum. And apparently the Air Force one day showed up, measured gravity, and they put this gravity station right in their floor. And I was doing research there one day and said, you know anything about it? I didn't know anything about it. Well, I do now. So yeah, if you're kind of bouncing around and you come across a gravity station, that's what's going on. But I'd be, like I said, I'd like, yeah, let me know. Okay, Penny and Robert and Justin have my contact information. Justin have my contact information. So yeah.
Very informative. It's good.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming. This was fun. Appreciate it.
All right. Students, be patient. We'll get you your extra credit certificate. Next week, Tuesday night, is our next presentation. Archaeologists John and Mavis Greer will be here. They're going to talk about rock art, so petroglyphs and pictographs. Excuse me. So come out for that.
Say
That
that fast,
is Tuesday night, May 23rd, 6 PM. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Mr. Brothers, very good. I was trying to learn a lot. I'm 63 and I still